This video was made possible thanks to CuriosityStream. Watch TLDR ad-free and get exclusive videos from us by signing up to the CuriosityStream Nebula bundle deal at curiositystream.com/TLDR Global. On Tuesday, China's National Bureau of Statistics released economics data for the first 2 months of 2022, and the results were impressive. On almost every metric, China outperformed expectations, and it looked like the Chinese economy was on track to meet its annual growth target of 5.5%. But despite the good start to the year, in the last few weeks, the Chinese economy has started to look fragile. The Chinese stock market has been down 15% since the beginning of March. The Chinese property market is continuing to crumble, and Omicron is straining the CCP's zero-COVID strategy. So we thought it would be a good idea to do a video on this, in which we're going to discuss the ongoing crisis in China's property sector, the recent outbreak of Omicron in mainland China and the Chinese response to it, and how all of these things will end up affecting the global economy. Before we begin, currently only about a quarter of you subscribe to the channel, so never miss a thing during this difficult time by subscribing and joining the TLDR gang. So let's start with the Chinese property sector. As we've explained in other videos, China's property market is pretty wild. Chinese house prices are by far and away the most expensive in the world. Your average house in Shenzhen, for example, costs over 40 times the median salary and 3 times that of London. Egged on by this lucrative market, over the last few decades, Chinese developers have begun borrowing ridiculous amounts of money. When house prices were going up, this was great business, but the CCP started to get a bit worried. For starters, they were worried that Chinese citizens were spending too much of their money on houses. And with their money tied up in property, Chinese citizens didn't have enough disposable income to drive China's domestic consumption. Sky-high house prices were also encouraging Chinese citizens to take out substantial mortgages, leaving them exposed to a credit crunch. But perhaps most importantly, the Chinese property market started looking suspiciously like a dangerously large bubble. Chinese house prices were sky high, despite the fact that Chinese population growth was basically stagnant, and Chinese developers were building more than enough houses to meet household growth. Essentially, it looked like the Chinese property market was being propped up by speculative investment, by people buying houses not to live in them, but as an investment strategy. This meant that if investors got spooked or decided they'd be better off investing their money elsewhere, then demand could dry up quickly, and developers would be left sitting on massive debts. This is why the CCP introduced their infamous 3 red lines in September last year, which essentially tried to limit how much developers could actually borrow. Unfortunately for, the entire Chinese property market, many big developers had just borrowed too much money. So when the CCP told them to start paying it back, they struggled to find the cash. This made other people less willing to lend them money, which made paying back their existing debts more difficult, and the cycle repeats. Essentially, what you have to understand is that Chinese developers only survived because they could easily and cheaply borrow money. So as this changes, the Chinese property market is at risk of collapse. Anyway, at least 14 separate property companies have defaulted since Evergrande, and sales have fallen across the board, affecting every large developer. This is also going to hurt local governments too, who rely on land sales to developers for most of their funding. The value of these land sales has fallen by a ridiculous 72% since last year, which has resulted in the Chinese government having to borrow more money to fund their local governments. And there's evidence that the credit environment, i.e. how easy it is to borrow money, is only going to get worse. Chinese property developers are finding it harder and harder to borrow money outside of China. And in February, lending to households fell for the first time in 15 years, which means that households will find it harder to take out a mortgage themselves, which means that they're going to be giving less money to developers. But things could get even worse for Chinese developers thanks to the war in Ukraine. The war and its accompanying sanctions will inevitably cause massive defaults, and there's even speculation that Russia itself will default on its sovereign debts, which could all spill over into the global credit markets. It's also possible that the accompanying supply chain disruption will push inflation yet harder. In response, central banks might decide to increase interest rates, which would also make borrowing harder. So in January, Xi Jinping warned the West that a rapid rise in interest rates could have spillover effects into the global economy. Obviously, no one knows exactly how this is going to play out, but the point we're trying to make is that it's possible the war in Ukraine could be the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to the already strained Chinese property sector. And property isn't China's only concern, there's also COVID. As you might already know, China adopted a so-called zero COVID strategy during the pandemic, which essentially involved using citywide lockdowns, mass testing, and stringent contact tracing to keep the number of infections as low as possible. China's strategy has been impressively effective thus far, keeping death rates relatively low, and as such, Chinese authorities have enjoyed comparing their successes with the relatively reckless Western policy, which they've dismissively described as social Darwinism. Omicron, though, which is both more transmissible and less symptomatic, has proved a bit of a challenge for zero COVID, and China is struggling to keep up with another wave of the virus. Hong Kong has been by far and away the worst hit. Omicron is ripping through care homes, and Hong Kong's low vaccination rate amongst the elderly means that the most recent wave has had a death rate of between 4 and 5%. There's also some evidence that China's Sinovac vaccine is less effective at blocking infection than the mRNA equivalents, and possibly less effective at preventing severe illness from Omicron too. Hong Kong's death toll is therefore surging past its Asia-Pacific peers, and while it's still well below that of most Western countries, they're on their way up. The wave has now seemingly spread to mainland China, which is seeing its highest case numbers since the beginning of the pandemic. Official numbers, which are probably a vast underestimate, put daily cases at 1,500. In keeping with its zero COVID strategy though, China has imposed massive lockdowns on the country, with some 90 million people living under some sort of lockdown as of Tuesday. While this clearly isn't ideal, the CCP doesn't really have much choice. It's invested a lot of political capital into its zero COVID strategy, and China doesn't have a great vaccination rate amongst its elderly, and even those who were vaccinated mostly used China's Sinovac vaccine, which has flaws that we've discussed earlier. Therefore, Chinese authorities have started talking about dynamic zero, which is a slightly more relaxed version of the current policy. But until the vaccination rate amongst the elderly is improved, the CCP are unlikely to change tack for fear of ending up like Hong Kong. Obviously, locking down whole cities isn't good for an economy, so if Omicron persists, the CCP's current GDP target of 5.5% will drift further and further out of reach. And as a final thing, it's worth asking how Chinese lockdowns will end up impacting the global economy. In one sense, you'd expect them to push inflation even higher. Lockdowns will mean less manufacturing capability and more supply chain disruption, which will increase the price of certain goods. For example, Shenzhen is home to China's infamous Foxconn factory, which produces many devices, including the iPhone. And if it stays closed, you'll expect prices to rise globally. On the other hand, widespread lockdowns should reduce energy demand, which could lower global energy prices a bit. As with all of these things, ultimately no one knows what the net effect will be. We're just pointing out some of the possible mechanisms that could come into play. So you get the point. Over the last few years, China's economy has held up well, and its zero COVID strategy has been remarkably effective. But unfortunately for the CCP, Omicron and the war in Ukraine could be about to change that. In fact, it's not only China which has cause for concern. The war in Ukraine could hit the entire global economy. We're not yet totally sure what impact will be felt globally, but we do have a video where we discuss all of the anticipated economic impacts and how it could touch your country too. And that video is available exclusively on Nebula, the streaming service my creator friends and I have teamed up to build, where we don't need to worry about demonetization or the algorithm. Over there you can find all of our latest videos ad-free, and we've also got a bunch of content available exclusively on Nebula, which will never come to YouTube. It's not just us either. All of our favourite educational creators are already there, like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, Polymatter, Legal, Half as Interesting, and many others. But wait, we said this video was brought to you by CuriosityStream, right? Well, as a platform full of the best documentaries online, they naturally love educational creators like us. As such, we've worked out a deal whereby if you sign up to CuriosityStream using the link in the description, you'll also get free access to Nebula. And that's not a free trial either. You'll get access as long as you remember. To make things even better, for a limited time, they're offering a deal where you can get 26% off their already low price, making an entire year of both services less than $15. Less than $15 a year for all of your favorite educational creators, as well as superb documentaries on CuriosityStream. Signing up at curiositystream.com/TLDR Global or clicking the link below not only gets you the deal, but also directly supports TLDR and educational content on the platform more generally, as well as getting you original content and an ad-free experience.